It was 12 minutes that shook a continent. A night sky in the southeast of Burkina Faso was pierced by the hum of unseen wings. And in less than the time it takes to boil water, a convoy was reduced to silence and smoke. What many dismissed as a marginal state had just displayed a weapon that could shift the map. This was not an accident. It was not a rogue commander testing his reach. It was a sovereign act, confirmed by the highest office of Ibrahim Traoré himself. At stake was not only the destruction of a convoy, but the defense of a $1.3 billion refinery, the spine of a nation's economic future. Africa, long spoken of as a pawn in the global game, had announced itself as a player. And with that announcement came a question that refuses to fade. Is this the dawn of a new balance of power, or the prelude to a storm that could engulf the Sahel? Stay with us, for this is not just another headline. It is history in motion. Subscribe and walk with us. The night was supposed to be silent, yet out of that silence came the metallic hum of a new era. Above the borderlands of Burkina Faso, drones circled like unblinking eyes. In just 12 minutes, the world's attention was pulled from its slumber to a place it had long ignored. This was not the kind of drone strike the world had come to expect. For decades, such technology had been the private instrument of superpowers. Washington deployed them with satellite networks worth billions. Paris used them as extensions of foreign missions. But here, in a landlocked state often dismissed as peripheral, something extraordinary had happened. A drone had been launched not by the West, but against the shadows said to be creeping into African soil. When the wreckage cooled, investigators found fragments that told a story of entanglement. American rifles lay twisted among the debris. French-coded radios, still hissing with static, were scattered like bones. Military ID tags carried Nigerian insignia, suggesting men who had once served one of West Africa's strongest armies were now in convoys aimed at destabilization. The vehicle logs, too, whispered of something larger. Shell companies registered in London, Paris, and Abu Dhabi had moved $75 million in only 6 months. Documents found at the site bore cryptic labels, Falcon Hand and DC Handler, symbols of a covert network threading through capitals far beyond the Sahel. For the people of Burkina Faso, the revelations felt like vindication. Their young leader, Ibrahim Traoré, had long warned that foreign mercenaries and multinational cartels sought to break their sovereignty. Now the proof lay twisted in the dust. His decision to strike first was praised in Ouagadougou as the mark of a captain unwilling to let his nation remain a victim. But there was more to the strike than the convoy it destroyed. What stunned military observers most was the machine itself. The drone was identified as the NA-7, a system born of unlikely collaboration. North Korean prototypes had been married with Russian navigation modules and refined through the AES, the Joint Security Pact linking Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The result was a platform with reach, precision, and independence. Its capabilities unsettled experts in Western capitals. With a range of nearly 800 kilometers, thermal-seeking missiles, and AI-guided accuracy, the NA-7 was christened in defense circles as the clean blade of Ouagadougou. In an environment where foreign drones had often missed their marks or caused civilian casualties, this one had struck with surgical certainty. 12 minutes from command to impact. No collateral damage. No room for denial. Symbolism ran deeper than steel and circuitry. For the first time, an African state had not only deployed advanced drone warfare, but claimed it openly. Traoré's office confirmed the order had come from the highest authority. There was no pretense of accident, no retreat into ambiguity. It was a declaration. Africa would defend its soil with tools once thought beyond its grasp. International media rushed to interpret the blast. Some called it reckless, a provocation that could spiral. Others framed it as a message of deterrence, a line drawn in the desert dust. Energy analysts warned that if such tactics spread, contracts worth billions across the Sahel could be shaken. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, citizens saw something else. They saw proof that sovereignty was not an empty word, but a stance taken with fire in the sky. Yet beneath the chants of pride lay a haunting riddle. Why had the convoy carried weapons and radios stamped with Western codes? Who were the financiers hidden behind those shell companies? And above all, who was the elusive DC Handler etched across intercepted files? The convoy's destruction was decisive, but the mystery of its origins remained. And so the story moved from the battlefield to the refinery that had provoked such fury. But what if the real battle was not the strike itself, but the refinery behind it? If the drone strike was the spark, then the refinery was the firewood stacked beneath it. The convoy destroyed that night was not wandering aimlessly. Intelligence files revealed its destination, the Kudu oil refinery, a facility valued at $1.3 billion, designed as Burkina Faso's boldest step toward energy independence. To outsiders, it was an industrial project. To Ibrahim Traoré, it was the spine of a nation learning to stand upright. Kudu was not simply about refining oil. It was about breaking the chains that had forced African states to export crude cheaply and re-import refined fuel at inflated prices. It was about ending a cycle of dependency that had drained budgets for generations. But someone wanted that spine broken before it could bear weight. Intercepted communications carried a chilling code: Operation Broken Spine. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Within 72 hours, the refinery was to be crippled by sabotage. Convoys carrying explosives had been spotted near the southeastern border. Satellite images aligned their position precisely with their refinery's coordinates. The message was clear: destroy Kudu before it could launch, and the dream of sovereignty would collapse before it began. In a secure chamber in Ouagadougou, the AES leadership gathered in urgency. Phones were confiscated, cameras banned. The atmosphere was heavy, as though history itself had been invited to the table. Some officials argued for quiet diplomacy, fearing escalation. But Traoré spoke with the conviction of one who believed hesitation was surrender. If they send ghosts, we send thunder, he declared. The decision was swift. The convoy identified as the imminent threat would be neutralized before it reached its target. And so, drones took flight under cover of darkness, completing their mission in 12 minutes. In that silence, a refinery was saved, and a doctrine was born. Sovereignty was no longer negotiable. Reactions erupted across the world. In Western capitals, analysts debated whether Traoré had acted recklessly or brilliantly. Washington issued cautious statements urging restraint. Paris struck a sharper tone, warning that destabilization threatened the Sahel. The European Union and NATO echoed those fears, painting the action as chaos wrapped in defiance. But in Ouagadougou, the air was electric. Independence Square overflowed with citizens waving flags, chanting that their nation had finally taken destiny into its own hands. In Bamako and Niamey, similar celebrations erupted, voices echoing beyond borders. Culture became part of the resistance. Graffiti artists painted murals of drones with the slogan, "Sovereignty is not negotiable." Afrobeat producers remixed Traoré's speeches into anthems that played from market stalls. A viral TikTok of university students reenacting his declaration, "If you send agents in the shadows, don't be surprised when we send fire," reached millions within days. Analysts calculated that the online momentum carried an advertising value worth tens of millions, proof that in the digital age, narratives were as potent as weapons. Western media scrambled to frame the story. Some labeled Traoré unpredictable, others reckless. Yet the defiant tone from Ouagadougou cut through. Standing before microphones, he declared, "You armed the mercenaries. You lit the fuse. We struck back." Those words spread like wildfire, amplified across Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. In less than 2 days, clips of his speeches amassed millions of views, with comments hailing him as a leader who refused to bow. Energy markets reacted with unease. Investors whispered that if drone strikes became the new tool of resource defense, contracts worth billions across the Sahel could be jeopardized. But for many Africans, the calculus was simpler. Better to risk markets than to surrender dignity. The paradox grew sharper. By defending Kudu, Traoré had both secured the nation's future revenues and provoked powerful adversaries. The refinery was no longer just infrastructure. It was a battlefield where sovereignty itself was contested. But the refinery was more than steel. It was the gateway to Africa's independence in energy. When the smoke cleared, Burkina Faso stood at a crossroads. The drones had saved the Kudu refinery, but the repercussions rippled far beyond steel and oil. The strike had redrawn the political landscape of the Sahel. Economically, the stakes could not have been higher. Analysts projected that Kudu, once fully operational, would generate nearly $400 million annually. That revenue was earmarked not for foreign shareholders, but for schools, hospitals, and technology. For the first time in decades, the possibility emerged that oil wealth might remain in African hands. The drone strike was, in that sense, more than an attack on armed convoys. It was a shield raised over future generations. Yet every shield cast a shadow. Investors in Paris and London whispered about risk premiums, warning that contracts worth billions might be reconsidered. In energy markets, rumors swirled that the Burkina model could spread across the Sahel. threatening comfortable profits once guaranteed by pliant governments. Politically, the implications were even sharper. The strike announced that Burkina Faso would no longer act as a pawn in someone else's game. By confirming responsibility, Ibrahim Traoré transformed what might have been dismissed as a mystery into a declaration of agency. Where others hedged behind plausible deniability, he stood before the world and said, "Yes, we struck, and we will strike again if our sovereignty is threatened." That honesty unsettled foreign powers used to African leaders speaking in whispers. Inside the country, the effect was profound. Citizens who had long endured poverty and interference felt a surge of pride. Demonstrations of support turned into celebrations, with murals and slogans spreading across Ouagadougou. The message was simple. Sovereignty was not just rhetoric, it was action. But revelations from the wreckage raised disturbing questions. Among the debris were not only weapons with Western markings, but also the identities of mercenaries who had once served in Nigeria's elite forces. These men had been trained in facilities financed by Western partnerships, only to re-emerge as hired guns against their neighbors. Could Nigeria truly claim ignorance? Or had its sovereignty, too, been compromised by dependency and manipulation? Digital forensics deepened the unease. Encrypted messages were traced back to servers in Virginia. Langley, the symbolic heart of American intelligence. Washington offered no acknowledgement. But for many in Africa, the implication was clear. Foreign hands had not only armed the saboteurs, but perhaps guided them. The revelation galvanized opinion across the Sahel. For years, suspicions lingered that destabilization was not random chaos, but orchestrated pressure. Now evidence seemed to confirm it. And so, what the world labeled as the Ibrahim Traoré coup was seen at home as something else entirely. Not a seizure of power, but a reclamation of it. The paradox of sovereignty was visible everywhere. On one side, citizens rejoiced that their leader had acted decisively, refusing to bow before hidden networks. On the other, they braced for retaliation. Sanctions, cyber attacks, or covert campaigns designed to punish defiance. Burkina Faso had chosen dignity, but dignity often came at a price. Still, the psychological shift was irreversible. Young people across the Sahel declared that the time of silent endurance was over. They had seen what 12 minutes of courage could do. They had watched as a refinery became a symbol, as a drone strike became a doctrine, as a leader's words lit fires of pride across borders. The message echoed like a drumbeat. Africa was no longer waiting to be saved. It was choosing to stand. But sovereignty at home meant little without the courage to face the world. The strike did not remain a domestic event. Within days, its tremors reached every corner of the global stage. At the heart of the response was the AES, the alliance of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. From an emergency summit emerged Operation Iron Shield, a commitment that any attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. It was more than rhetoric. It was the first African-led defense pact rooted not in foreign aid or UN mandates, but in shared determination. Encrypted lines were established. Satellites from new partnerships with Russia and China fed into AESnet, a network designed to detect threats before they struck. Joint patrols of drones and fighter jets flew under a single flag. For the first time, Africans were crafting their own shield. The symbolism was immense. Across markets and villages, people began calling it Africa's first shield. Murals depicted the three leaders standing beneath a metallic barrier, inscribed with the words "Sovereignty is Defense." Students organized hackathons to improve AESnet, while musicians released tracks praising what they called the Iron Shield generation. International reactions, however, were less celebratory. In Washington, officials urged restraint, hinting that escalation would destabilize the region. Paris was sharper, its media warning that a Sahel bloc moving beyond Western oversight could fracture existing security frameworks. The European Union echoed concerns, framing the development as a dangerous precedent. Think tanks in London described Iron Shield as a pivot toward Moscow and Beijing. Markets, too, grew jittery. Energy investors whispered that if the model spread, contracts worth billions could be renegotiated under less favorable terms. Analysts estimated that foreign corporations risk losing between $15 and $20 billion annually if African nations followed Burkina Faso's path of reclaiming control over resources. But the strongest voices came not from boardrooms, but from the streets. For citizens of the Sahel, this was not geopolitics, but dignity. Operation Iron Shield was proof that Africa could defend itself without subcontracting sovereignty. It was a declaration that security was not a foreign gift, but a right to be claimed. In this light, many began speaking of the Burkina Faso Revolution, not as a violent upheaval, but as a doctrine of self-reliance spreading through the continent. For decades, critics argued that Africa could never unite militarily without external mediation. Iron Shield had dismantled that narrative in a single stroke. And yet, even as pride swelled, questions lingered. Could the alliance withstand sanctions, cyber warfare, and the relentless pushback of those who thrived on a fractured Africa? Or was this the first fragile step toward a new doctrine that would redefine Africa's place in the 21st century? But could this iron shield withstand the storm of sanctions and covert attacks yet to come? The drone strike may have lasted 12 minutes, but its echoes will carry for years. For Burkina Faso and for the Sahel, the question now is not whether the refinery was saved, but whether the momentum can endure. The risks are clear. Sanctions from foreign powers may tighten around the economy. Cyber attacks could seek to paralyze AESnet before it matures. Covert campaigns fueled by shell companies and hidden hands may try again to fracture unity. The burden of defiance is heavy, and history shows that those who challenge entrenched orders rarely escape retaliation. Yet the opportunities are no less real. By securing Kudu, Burkina Faso has preserved hundreds of millions in future revenues, resources that can be channeled into classrooms, clinics, and laboratories instead of foreign bank accounts. By forging Iron Shield, it has proven that Africans can coordinate their own security. By declaring the New Sahel Doctrine, it has set a precedent that sovereignty can be codified into policy, not just spoken in speeches. These choices mark a generational shift. Young people across the region have tasted what dignity feels like. They no longer see sovereignty as a slogan, but as a seed planted in their soil. And if sovereignty is a seed, then unity is the rain, and sacrifice is the harvest. What was once seen as fragile ground now holds the possibility of a future where Africa defines itself not by dependency, but by determination. Still, the path forward is uncertain. Will the Iron Shield inspire more nations to join, building a continental defense strong enough to resist external pressure? Or will fragmentation return, leaving the Sahel exposed once again? Will the revenues from Kudu truly reach schools and hospitals? Or will corruption corrode the promise of independence? The answers will determine not only the fate of Burkina Faso, but the trajectory of Africa in the 21st century. For now, the refinery stands, the alliance holds, and the doctrine resonates. The thunder sent into the night was not only a warning to mercenaries, it was a message to the world. Africa will not wait to be managed. It will choose to stand. But the final question was not about weapons, it was about will. The night of the drone strike had passed, but its message lingered like smoke over the Sahel. Burkina Faso had shown that even a small nation, long overlooked, could wield tools once reserved for superpowers. Through decisive action, Ibrahim Traoré had not only protected a $1.3 billion refinery, but also drawn a line in the sand. Sovereignty was not negotiable. The ripple effects were profound. Citizens across the Sahel felt a surge of pride, young people recognized their agency, and the continent began to imagine a future where resources, security, and decisions belonged first to Africans. In the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, chants echoed, "No sovereignty, no future." On social media, murals, TikTok videos, and music celebrated what was rapidly being called the Iron Shield generation. Yet the world beyond Africa's borders watched closely. Western powers recalculated the cost of interference. Analysts warned of potential sanctions, cyber threats, and covert retaliation. Energy markets fretted over billions in contracts. But through every threat, the lesson was clear. Burkina Faso, by embracing its own capacity, had altered the balance of power. It was no longer a passive state, it had become a statement. For historians, policymakers, and citizens alike, this moment signaled a turning point. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was more than a military action. It was a declaration that African nations could act decisively, defend their interests, and shape their own future. The Burkina Faso revolution was underway, not in the streets alone, but in minds and in the doctrines that now guide national and regional defense. The drone strike may have lasted 12 minutes, but the lessons will resonate for generations. Africa has proven it can protect its resources, assert its sovereignty, and inspire a continent-wide awakening. The question now falls to each citizen. Will this audacity inspire further unity and progress? Or will it invite a storm of resistance from those who fear an unchained Africa? If you believe in Africa's dignity and the power of sovereignty, Subscribe, comment, and share this story. You are part of this unfolding history, and the choices made today will shape the continent's future.